Hey folks, Dale Davidson here. Thank you for tuning in. It's the Dear VA Guy show today. Got a letter that I want to share with you, and I'm going to apologize. I'm going to read this because it's 3 pages long, but we've got something interesting going on here. It all involves toxic exposure to our veterans and the effects it has on them, as well as the effects on their spouses and dependents. And so I'm going to read this letter today, and then we're going to go over a little bit of information. This is a 3-part video series. We're going to do the letter today. We're going to look at the solutions tomorrow, and then the next day, next video, the 3rd video, we're going to be exploring all of the toxic bases of the U.S. military. So it's a pretty scary thing, so stay tuned. Okay, so excuse me, I'm going to put my glasses on. So this is from, let's see, what's his name? Feeling Screwed by My Government. Okay, first of all, I apologize for the length of this letter, but it's important that you know why I'm asking for your help. Help for me and help for all veterans and their families who have been exposed by toxins or exposed to toxins by our government. I believe with all my heart that my exposure to toxins and PCBs, including but not limited to Agent Orange, while in the service of the U.S. Army, caused me to develop multiple sclerosis and ischemic heart disease. Now, this is not just for the Army. This is for all branches of service, okay? Now, many years ago, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis from my exposure to toxic defoliants, PCBs, and other toxins from my service in the U.S. Army. I honorably served in the U.S. Army at Fort McClellan from May 1986 to January 1992. Fort McClellan was closed in 1999. Tons of Agent Orange and other highly toxic volatile substances like uranium and nerve gas were stored at Fort McClellan, exposing me and thousands of service members and civilians to these toxic chemicals and causing lasting damage to me and others. During my service at Fort McClellan, I spent most of my time training outdoors and was exposed to various toxins that have left me 100% disabled. While training, we were bivouacked outdoors in areas sprayed with toxic defoliants and drank the groundwater that was contaminated with PCBs and other toxins. We were told to put iodine tablets in our canteens to make the water safe for drinking. There are 3 main sources of toxic exposure to me and those of us who worked and lived on and in Fort McClellan and the surrounding cities. I think that was Aniston, yeah. The first source of toxic contamination came from Monsanto. They produced Agent Orange and other toxic herbicides. Each of these toxic herbicides was developed to focus on killing specific plant types. You may recall the movie about Monsanto and Erin Brockovich. The law firm she worked for sued Monsanto over their poisonings of Aniston, Alabama residents with a damage award of $700 million for the 18,000 plaintiffs. Now, this is where it gets interesting in this letter. In Admiral Elmo Zumwalt's 1990 report to the Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs on the association between adverse health effects and exposure to Agent Orange, they call it the Zumwalt report, he quotes Dr. James Clary, a former government scientist with the Chemical Weapons Branch, saying, when we, the military scientists, initiated the herbicide program in the 1960s, we were aware of the potential for damage due to toxin contamination to the herbicide. We were even aware that the military formulation had a higher dioxin concentration than the civilian version due to the lower cost and speed of manufacture. However, because the material was to be used on the enemy, none of us were overly concerned. We never considered the scenario in which our own personnel would be contaminated with the herbicide. I'll stop right there. So we're spraying, in Vietnam, we're spraying the herbicide over thousands of acres while our troops are on the ground. You don't think, you people didn't think to say, hey, maybe they're going to be inhaling this, or maybe they're going to be drinking the groundwater? Come on. Okay, I'll get back on track. The second source of contamination was from the myriad of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, some dating back to World War I on Fort McClellan itself, as well as the herbicides used on Fort McClellan. The final U.S. Department of Defense base realignment and closure ordnance, ammunitions, and explosive chemical warfare materials conclusion and recommendations report, wow, it's a mouthful, discusses the issue of these weapons and materials on Fort McClellan. He gives me a link to the report. This open source DoD document states that nuclear, biological, and chemical materials were used, tested, and stored at Fort McClellan, and the areas involved were contaminated. These areas were easily accessed by me and fellow soldiers stationed and working at Fort McClellan. While stationed at Fort McClellan, I had access to and trained in these contaminated areas. The risk assessment for the main post rates this installation as a catastrophic Category 1, with the statement, there's evidence that explosive ordnance has been used at this site since 1912. There is also evidence that CWM contamination may also exist. In addition to a variety of herbicides, many of which contain PCBs, were used at Fort McClellan over the years. These herbicides were used to clear vegetation on the gunnery, shooting, and training areas and ranges and other bivouac areas at Fort McClellan. I was bivouacked in these contaminated areas and of course trained on the gunnery, shooting ranges, and other contaminated areas. The third source of contamination was from the Aniston Army Depot. Now, let me stop. If you will Google Fort McClellan and look at where Fort McClellan sits as it relates to Aniston, Alabama, as it relates to the Army Depot, and they're really right there in the same neighborhood. So this depot is an active U.S. Army installation. The installation provided munition storage and refurbishment, testing, and decommissioning of combat vehicles and various types of ordnance. Operations at the depot generated solid and liquid waste that contaminated soil and groundwater. So the EPA placed a portion of the depot on the National Priorities List in 1989. In 1990, the EPA and the Army agreed to address the entire depot under the Superfund and Resource Conservation and Recovery Act programs. The Army, EPA, and the Alabama Department of Environmental Management have investigated site conditions and took steps to clean the depot in order to protect people and the environment from contamination. And he gives me that link to that report. And I'll be glad to give you a link as well, just let me know. Site investigations found contamination in groundwater and soils that could potentially harm people in the area. Contaminants of concern include chromium, lead, thulium, trichloroethylene, and trichloroethylene. Sorry, I cannot pronounce a lot of these words. The Aniston Army Depot has also been routinely dumping detergents holding a chemical TCE into the public drinking water supply in the town of Aniston. Now, Fort McClellan purchased its water from Aniston. TCE all by itself is not toxic. However, it is if it is swallowed. I'm positive that I swallowed TCE while drinking water. The contamination ended in the year 1987, a year after I was stationed there. Of course, that was 1986. The remediation by the EPA began in 1983, so there was a 4-year declining period of TCE content as the cleanup continued. People like me who lived and worked on Fort McClellan were targets for the PCBs and other contaminants, as well as nuclear, biological, and chemical toxins through air, groundwater, and soil. I was lying on them on the firing range and on bivouac. I filled my canteen from the polluted streams, and I breathed them while marching and running. The multiple contamination sources caused by Monsanto, Fort McClellan, and the Aniston Army Depot put me at a severe health risk. I am currently experiencing the debilitating results of this exposure and ingestion of these toxic contaminants. So, I've applied for compensation, been turned down, appealed, and done everything I know to do. Again, I apologize for the length of this letter, but I and others need your help. Feeling screwed by my government. Well, that's pretty scary. Think about this, folks. You have an army depot and a fort so close to civilian areas that not only is a private company like Monsanto did they contaminate everything, but the army and the is contaminating their own bases. And we'll be doing a video here in a couple of weeks on all of the contaminated bases throughout the United States. Okay, here's my reply to feeling screwed by my government. Now, this reply is complicated, so stay tuned for the next video, because I'm going to give you the what I believe to be the correct answer. So, you've applied for compensation, been turned down, and you think you've done everything you know to do. You've got a current diagnosis of multiple sclerosis from your private physician. How did you link your MS, your multiple sclerosis, to your exposure to these toxic chemicals during your service at Fort McClellan? So you had active service between, was it 1996 and 1986 and 1992, I think it was, whatever the dates are. But you're at Fort McClellan, okay? So you were there. Now, unfortunately, your dilemma's not new, okay? But it's solvable, okay? You contend that because your exposure to toxins, including dioxins, and you develop MS. Again, we need to look at all of the evidence connecting your MS to your toxic exposure. So under the relevant laws as they stand today and the VA regulations, service connection can be granted for disabilities resulting from a disease like MS or an injury incurred or aggravated during service. Okay. In previous videos we've gone over this, but I'm going to go over again because it bears repeating. Okay. Your evidence must show the existence of a present disability. Okay, you've got that diagnosis. Okay. There's an in-service occurrence or an aggravation of a disease or injury, and there's some kind of causal connection, relationship between your disability and your service, okay? So certain chronic diseases are subject to presumptive service connections if manifest to a certain degree within a period, say 1 year from separation of service. But it all depends upon the disease. However, and unfortunately in your case, multiple sclerosis has a 7-year presumption of service connection. But don't worry, okay? Don't worry, because there is a court decision out there that says that you have a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis after the 7-year presumptive period. That warranted the granting of service connection where there was evidence of symptoms within 7 years after service, and subsequent medical opinion attributed those symptoms to your multiple sclerosis. So unfortunately, you don't get the advantage of using a presumptive list for Agent Orange because you didn't serve in the Republic of Vietnam and you didn't serve during Vietnam. And MS isn't on the presumptive list for Agent Orange exposure. So that's not available to you, but all is not lost. We can still help you establish service connection for your MS if evidence otherwise indicates a relationship between your disorder and your active service. That's what we're going to be discussing in our next video, so stay tuned. Hey folks, while you're waiting on that video, hey, check out this video that I talked about the Camp Lejeune. So give you some more information on toxic exposures for the Marine Corps.